Hello and welcome to the webinar. Today we'll be discussing tips and tricks in Acumen 360. I'm Tom Poland, the Director of Professional Services at Acumen. Acumen 360 is the third component in the Acumen suite. Over the past couple of days, we've discussed tips and tricks both in Acumen Fuse and Acumen Risk. Now, some call Acumen 360 the icing on the cake in the Acumen suite, and others call it the best kept secret in the Acumen suite. Well, you might have your own opinion after you see some of the tips and tricks today. First, let's talk a little bit more about Acumen as a company. Acumen truly believes in improving planning, accuracy, and reliability for a project plan. Analytics is practically our middle name. We want to know exactly what's going on in a plan so the project that the plan is for can be poised for a tremendous amount of success. We believe that a sound plan, a strong baseline is needed for that. In addition, a plan that maintains its quality through execution. As we talked about in yesterday's webinar, risk consideration is a huge component as well, both from the baseline standpoint and from an ongoing standpoint. Today with 360, we'll be talking about the next step after risk consideration. Some of the recognition that we're proud of at Acumen is Planning Innovation of the Year 2012 and an Inc. 500 fastest growing company. Our legacy is 25 plus years of thought leadership, and we're trusted by Fortune 500 and many of the industry leaders that you see here on the right-hand side of the screen. Let's talk about Acumen's S1 to S5 schedule maturity framework. The reason why this is important is it governs everything that we do at Acumen when it comes to developing our software and helping to meet your needs. The model starts at S1 with the schedule basis. These are the scheduling and cost tools that you're using today. We don't replace those, we work in addition to those. You'll use the S1 process to begin to develop your baseline plan. Now, your baseline is not complete at the end of S1, but it's ready to be critiqued as part of the S2 process. That's where our Acumen Fuse solution comes in with its project diagnostics. It also has the ability not only to observe your schedule, but it has the ability to cleanse your schedule in certain areas as well to increase its quality. S3 incorporates the use of a risk-adjusted schedule. With Acumen Risk, we support both probabilistic and deterministic risk, and we support the risk driver process. Through an iterative risk assessment process, which may involve a risk workshop, you may at this point have a risk-adjusted schedule which no longer meets your contractual obligations. Now, that's not a desirable situation for any project, and the fact is, in S4, the optimization phase, you may need to do something about that. That's where Acumen 360 comes into play, and that's what we will be discussing today. The goal from the project optimization phase is to understand if your project can be optimized, should it be optimized, and if it does need to be optimized, the ability to export that schedule and use it as your new working master. Finally, once you have an optimal schedule, you can go through the S5 team validation and buy-in process, where all of the executives, technical managers, and project stakeholders get to observe what's in the schedule and buy into the schedule and commit to the execution. Okay, so now let's talk more about Acumen 360. The benefits are several. You can recover from delays and maintain alignment with your project goals. You have the ability to perform automatic scenario generation under parameters that you yourself govern. There's also a manual interactive mode as well, which we'll be showing you during the presentation. The fact is, during the baseline process and during program execution, you might run into events, assumptions, and risks which will prohibit you from meeting your original project goals. Acumen 360 is your tool to help you meet your project goals despite the chaos of a program execution environment. The audience for the tool: schedulers, planners, project managers, really project stakeholders. Anyone who is involved in the project in any capacity may wish to see how their scenario, their portion of the schedule, can be optimized. Some of the features, I'm going to be demonstrating these in detail, so I'm not going to go through them much from a bullet point perspective, but there are 3 modes of acceleration that we'll be looking at. We're going to compare our accelerated scenario to our initial scenario, and we can do this as many times as we need to as part of a what-if analysis. Now, when we find that scenario that we really think we can live with and will help us meet our project goals, we can export that scenario back to our scheduling tool and use that as our integrated master schedule going forward. Here's the 3 acceleration options or modes in the tool. The first is automatic acceleration. This is focused primarily on the critical path. Next, we have targeted acceleration. This is my favorite mode because we get to control which areas of the schedule get accelerated and which don't. And when I say which areas, you'll define those areas. We won't define those areas for you, but we'll help you get to those definitions. And I'll show you how we do that with our script and step editor. Finally, one of the user's favorite modes is this interactive mode. It performs a real-time forward and backward pass on your schedule as you make changes to different areas. Now again, areas is up to you. That can be the lowest level of detail in the schedule, or you can actually make adjustments at a high level in the schedule that'll filter down to the more detailed tasks. Also, the interactive mode is where you can introduce schedule deceleration, and we'll talk about that as well. We'll start with the interactive mode today. It's one of the most visually compelling modes, and it's very easy to use in the software. You group activities any way that you'd like. I'm going to use my standard WBS grouping in the program that I'll show you in a minute. You can add or remove duration, like I mentioned, at the top level, the lowest level of detail, or anywhere in between, using these very easy to use calibration sliders. If you choose to add or remove duration at the top level, the settings will cascade down to the children activities. And because this all works in real time, you can immediately view the impact of what you're doing. So let's go over to the Acumen tool. And what I've done for the sake of time today is I've already opened a project. It doesn't take very long. I used a Primavera schedule, which I have open on the screen here. And I can expand it through any level of the WBS. The columns that I have are standard project information that you might find in your scheduling tool, with one exception. We have the calibration column here. Right now, by default, everything is set to off. Now, the moment when I start to calibrate, it's going to warn me. It's going to tell me something. It's going to tell me that calibration is only allowed on scenarios, and it's asking me if I want to create a new scenario for calibration. I'm going to say yes. It hasn't touched the original file. It's creating a second version of the file, and we mentioned earlier comparison, understanding my optimized scenario versus my baseline scenario. And that's exactly what it's allowing me to do here, is it's allowing me to make changes to my activity duration calibration without changing my original plan. So let's expand out the scenario, which right now is a carbon copy of my baseline plan. And let's expand some of these areas. Now, what I can initially do is I can move the slider at the top program level. And as I scroll through the options on the slider, requires much less time, requires less time, realistic, requires more time, finally requires much more time. I'm actually able to control these values, and I'll show you that in a couple of minutes. We're going to use the defaults for right now. Let's start the whole program out as realistic. But then what we can do is we can go into some of the individual detailed areas and we can make adjustments. And as I mentioned before, as I make those adjustments at the intermediate levels, the tasks beneath them are being adjusted as well. Now, that doesn't preclude me from going in and making adjustments to individual tasks to change their duration. So really what I'm doing here is using a very concise, easy-to-use method to make sweeping adjustments to my activity durations in a very short amount of time. Now, that's a double-edged sword because I could quickly create an unrealistic scenario. So the ownership is on me to understand which areas need to be accelerated, which areas can be decelerated, so that I can come up with my final optimized scenario. Now, obviously, there's pitfalls to that, and this isn't the targeted method that I'll be showing you in a few minutes. Now, some of the reasons why I might want to use this are, one, to accelerate when I know acceleration can take place. I might need to decelerate due to a funding profile or scenario that I'm trying to match. Our partners in the defense industry right now are going through some lean times where there's not as much funding available as there used to be. So many of the programs still need to be executed. However, they're being executed in slower timeframes so that the contractor can get paid routinely by the government. So what was a 1-year project might be a 1.5 or maybe a 2 or 3-year project. Acumen 360 allows you to open that project schedule, make calibration adjustments to speed up, or in this case, slow down the project so it can match a funding profile. Acceleration, of course, might be needed if you need to meet a contractual end date and you're not on a path to get there at present. So let me make some more adjustments. And one thing you may notice is as I make these adjustments, the Gantt chart in the lower right-hand corner of the screen is being adjusted in real time as well. Within Acumen 360, in fact, in the entire Acumen suite, we perform full critical path method schedule analysis based on the information in your schedule. So that's actually being performed in real time as you move these sliders. Now, one thing I mentioned earlier is you yourself can make adjustments to what the calibration slider is doing, and that's according to our calibration template. And let me show you where that is. We can control the number of choices on the calibration template, the name of each of the items on the calibration template, and then also the factor that's applied to each. We start with a symmetrical distribution between green and red. However, you can adjust these names and percentages to anything that you'd like. Much of your work might be deceleration, so you might wish to bias this list towards deceleration. If you're always in the business of acceleration, you might want to do the opposite. It's up to you, and you get full control over these parameters, and you can even save this template for use on other projects as well. Now with this scenario intact, let's use some of our other methods to create some other scenarios, and then we can compare them. So let's go back to our slides for a minute. We'll talk about comparison in a moment. Let's talk about here targeted acceleration. Here we go. Okay, now here is where you can give the application parameters that you want to use to have it quickly produce scenarios that might help you meet a targeted finish date for your project. This applies a bit more intelligence than just moving the sliders around and seeing what happens, as we did a couple minutes ago. Now, there's a time and a place for both methods. Let's talk about how this method works, and then you'll be able to choose which would be more applicable to your situation. We have filters. I'll show you those. We have acceleration limits, and we can set a finish date goal. We can set acceleration strategy for an individual task as well. Let's go out to Fuse or 360 and show you how that's all done. So instead of using these sliders this time, let's go back up to our main plan and let's click the Accelerate Schedule button. Now there's many moving parts on this screen, so I'll step through it one step at a time. The first part of the screen is the Schedule Cleanser. Here you have the opportunity to remove redundant logic, hard constraints, soft constraints, leads, lags. You can even convert your lags to activities. Now the reason for this is these constraints may hamper your ability to optimize your schedule. Think about it. Many of your tasks in your schedule have hard constraints, like mandatory finish dates. You're only going to be able to contract the schedule so much until you start bumping into those constraints, which aren't going to move because they're hard constraints. Using the Schedule Cleanser as part of the acceleration, you have the opportunity to remove those constraints so that you have smoother flowing logic and ultimately the potential of a better optimization exercise. Let's remove hard constraints and soft constraints, and we'll leave the others alone right now, and we'll see how much optimization we can get from this schedule. Next, you have the ability to accelerate a schedule or an activity. You can select a goal date, or you can select an acceleration factor. I call this turning up the heat, and you can see we're reducing the overall duration of our project, which is in orange, as we move this slider down. Now we have to be realistic. If we try to contract the whole project duration to 10% of its original value, we're probably not going to get there. So let's start with something more meaningful, and then we'll come back here again and we'll see how much we can turn up the heat. The other thing we can do is we can select the best date possible and have the system tell us, based on the acceleration strategy that we use, where it thinks we're able to finish this project. First, let's try for our own date. We'll say July 28th, 2011 versus a current finish date of January 31st, 2013. Certainly very ambitious. For now, let's use the script called normal acceleration. We're going to look at the details of that in a few minutes. And let's go ahead and run the script. Very quickly, it's come back and it's given us some information. It's told us the original project finish date was January 31st. We targeted July 28th. It was able to achieve a goal of August 26, 2011. So it's not quite everything we were asking for, but it certainly is ambitious to finish in August 2011 compared to the January 31st, 2013 completion date. Now, we have a few options at this point. We didn't get everywhere that we wanted to with this schedule. We're about a month off, but we might wish to do some scenario analysis. So we have some options. We can add the scenario or not add the scenario. We can add the scenario and try again. My favorite at this point is to add the scenario and go to forensics, because this will tell us all the changes that are needed from our baseline to meet the original project, to meet the targeted goal of, or the achieved goal of August 26th versus the original project finish of January 31st. To show us all the changes that need to be made in order to accomplish the acceleration. So let's do that. Let's start there. And we actually have three scenarios at work. We have the original baseline, we have the scenario that we created using the sliders, and then we have the scenario that we created using targeted acceleration. The great thing about forensics is it'll show me the difference between any number of projects using our initial plan as our basis, and then showing me the changes that would be needed to meet the two different plans that I created. Now, when you see red, it means you need to accelerate activities. When you see blue, it means there's either no change or there's an increase in activity durations. If you recall, when we adjusted the sliders, we moved some of the sliders to green, which increased the duration of the tasks. And you can see those increases here. Now, when we did targeted acceleration, we really needed to cut things down from a duration standpoint. So in our scenario one, where we tried for a January 2011 date, it got us to August, and it significantly reduced many durations on the project. Now, can those reductions actually be made? Well, what we can do is we can group by WBS name, and we can communicate with each one of these WBS owners. We can show them the differences, and we can have them comment as to whether or not they feel they can rally the resources to be able to perform this work in the accelerated time frame. If they can't, we can easily remove this plan and start over. If they can, we might just have our next master schedule. Now, let's go back to our project screen. We have a few different scenarios now. Let me, just for the sake of simplicity, remove one of that first manual scenario that we created in the interactive mode. And let's go to the acceleration tab, because what I wanted to do is I really want to show you what's going on behind the scenes of these acceleration scripts. They work very reliably, and many of our users are taking the scripts at face value. But this is a tips and tricks session, so I really want to show you what goes into these scripts and how they actually work. Then also how we can do that ultimate level of targeted acceleration as well, where we include or exclude certain areas from the exercise. Right now, we've been working across the entire program and we've been targeting the critical path, but we can target other areas as well. So let me show you that. Oops. Let's go to the S4 Acceleration tab now, instead of this button on the main screen. Okay, now you might recognize these script libraries from the previous screen. We used normal acceleration, and let me show you what that means. It means it will reduce activity durations by up to 50%. If a task has 20 days of duration, it might end up with 10 days of duration after the acceleration exercise. It might end up with 13, 14, or 15 days of duration as well, depending on what the system needs to do to optimize your project. Now, down here in the step library, there's a series of steps that can be applied to the normal acceleration script. This script has one step, but I'll show you some more scripts that have multiple steps in a moment. But let's look a little more in detail at this one. Reduce duration by up to 50%. Well, where does it know? How does it know where to start, and how does it know when to stop? Well, it knows where to start because we've told it to start with the easiest activities first. Now, the easiest activities to gain time back in your project are the activities on the critical path. If these critical path activities are reduced by 1 day, if a critical path activity is reduced by 1 day, your project finish date may reduce by 1 day. Now, if there's secondary critical paths that are very near the primary critical path, you'll get diminishing returns. What would be a more difficult path to accelerate? A path that had multiple concurrent activities, where multiple tasks would need a duration reduction in order to expedite the finish of the project. So we give you some choices. You can look at the easiest first, which is going to target critical path activities. You can look at earliest activities first, activities further in the project, further in the future. Or one theory is that you can target the longest activities first because they might have the most potential to have some duration reduced from them. It might be easier to shave 5 days off a 100-day activity than a 10-day activity. So you have the freedom to modify the scripts and steps, save those, and then use those for your own as a template. We give you our suggestions out of the box in the tool. Everything you're seeing here is exactly the way things are set up in the tool by default. Now let's look at a more sophisticated script. This one is similar to normal acceleration, but on its own, it first removes all constraints in the schedule. If you remember, we did that on ours manually using the schedule cleanser. This script does that automatically. The first thing it does is it removes all the constraints. The second thing it does is reduces the duration by up to 50%. Let's look at an even more sophisticated script. This one has 4 steps. The first thing it will do is remove all constraints. The second is to remove predecessor lag by 50%, easiest first. Step 3 is to reduce successor lag by 50%, easiest first. And then finally, extreme acceleration is called extreme for a reason. It will then begin reducing activity durations by up to 100%. I can almost guarantee that this extreme acceleration script will get you to your target finish date. Well, you have to remember too, that may not be realistic. But if you need to portray what it would take to meet a particular target date, extreme acceleration is the best script to use. Again, it might not work for your project because you might not be able to accelerate a 3-year project into a 1-year time frame. Although this system will show you how that could be accomplished if you were able to gather the resources necessary to be able to do that. Finally, planned activity acceleration looks at planned activities, only activities that haven't started yet. It leaves in progress activities alone. Now it does that using a filter. Let's talk more about these filters. Let's go to normal acceleration, create a filter set, and start adding some criteria. What I can do is, let's choose location. I may know for sure that I don't have the potential to expedite activities or optimize activities in a certain location. So let's say location does not equal New Jersey. The optimization exercise will be run on all activities in the project except those where the location equals New Jersey. By saying location does not equal New Jersey, it'll work with any location except for New Jersey. Now I have a full set of operators, so I could optimize only New Jersey activities. I can also use mathematical values, so to affect activities that only have duration greater than a certain amount, or even above a certain or below a certain cost level. Any standard fields, user-defined fields, or code fields that you have in your project are fair game for these filters. Oh, one more thing. You can have complex compound criteria as well by adding additional filters. So I could say location equals New Jersey, and then establish where the, let's say, baseline cost is greater than a certain value. And I can just type that value right in here. That's the ultimate level of focus for my optimization activity. You might have departments where the intervals are standard and there's nothing that you can do to affect those intervals of production. So you can use the filters to leave those areas alone while also using the filters to target areas that are ripe for optimization. Okay, let's go back over to our slides, talk about how we can use this for decision support. One thing I'll demonstrate when we go back into the software, actually I'm going to demonstrate several things, but since we're in the Acumen suite, I can run the diagnostics that I've run on my baseline on my optimized scenario as well. And we'll go to the diagnostic screen and we'll do that, and you'll see the differences. You'll even see some scoring differences between the different schedules, especially when we remove the constraints using the schedule cleanser. We went over to forensics to compare scenarios to find out what's changed. And you can even use the timeline view on the S1 project screen to view changes to the project finish or any individual activity in the project. So let's do a couple things back in the Acumen suite. And then finally, if we have a scenario that we like, we'll export it back to our scheduling tool. Oop, here we go. Oops, here we go. Okay, so let's go to that diagnostic screen. We had created our scenario that remains is the one that we targeted. One more thing is I can go to this scenario and I can rename this to be targeted acceleration. It doesn't have to be called initial plan scenario 1. We can designate our own name for it, which might make more sense to us. So let's return over to this diagnostic screen and run our fuse scoring on this project. Well, the two scores come out about the same. In fact, even a little bit lower. Our initial plan was just over 3 years long. Our targeted acceleration is just 1.5 years long. And the system now believes some of our tasks have insufficient detail because many of the activity durations have stayed the same while the overall project has gotten shorter. Those durations now represent more than 10% of the project duration. At that point, when there's durations higher than 10% of project execution, we tend to feel that there's not enough detail in the project schedule. So that's something that you might wish to address if you do cut the time frame down on a project, is some of your durations might be really too large relative to the overall size of the project. So overall, we haven't improved our score at all, but this is an iterative process. We could continue to make tweaks and changes and hopefully end up with a higher fuse schedule index score. But we're not going to do that right now. Let's say that we are satisfied with the work that we've done with this scenario. All I need to do to get that scenario back into Primavera is to export it as an XCR file. We'll call this optimized. We know it still has some issues, but this is just a demonstration. Call this optimized schedule. We'll click save. And now I have an XCR file stored on my computer that I can import back into P6 and use as my master schedule. I can do that at project baseline. I can do that at any point during project execution with my status schedule as well. And all of that information will remain intact as I move from Primavera into 360 and then back out to Primavera. I'm not losing any fidelity in my schedule. As part of that process, I'm gaining the ability to understand my diagnostics, perform risk exercises, and then finally perform the optimization process as well. So to wrap up and review, we've gone through the final step where we've exported our scenario. Just to recap what we've done today, we started with a third item. We started with the interactive analysis. That's where I was moving the sliders around. We did some acceleration. We did some deceleration as well. Perhaps we were creating a proposal schedule that was based on some past work that we've done, and there was a higher or lower complexity factor to the proposed work than to the past work. We could load in that old schedule. We could change the sliders around to add or decrease complexity and then export it back. We might have a fairly seamless proposal schedule. Next, we went to targeted acceleration. We started out with our normal acceleration, which really focuses in on the critical path. And then finally, we went to the most sophisticated screen with the scripts and steps on it. We chose different scripts to see what they look like. We looked at, for instance, we looked at normal, and then we looked at extreme acceleration to see how different they really are. And then we went in and we did the filters so that we could target New Jersey or not target New Jersey, and we could add cost to see if we just wanted to target items that had a certain cost or other measurable criteria. And that brought us full circle through our S1 to S5. At that point, after the optimization, we're ready to circulate the information to the stakeholders and team members and see if we have created that new optimized master schedule. Okay, well, this was just a short look at some of our tools today, primarily Acumen 360, but you might want some more information. Where can you find it? Right here on the screen. I've put up our website address where you can find white papers and even have a software trial. If you're an existing Acumen Fuse or Risk user, you can get a trial for Acumen 360 to try that out as well. You can reach us on Twitter, and of course, we have our email address as well that you can use to communicate with us. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed the session.